Welcome to the All Out Coach show. I'm joined today by a special guest who's going to help us understand how to explore our scientific curiosity as well as our sportsmanship, which are the two qualities and characteristics that I talk about a lot at All Out Coach. Because some of the most successful organizations that are able to grow quickly are the ones in which every single employee, every single member is or considers themselves a scientist and a sports athlete. Today, my guest is the director of the Bladder Cancer program at the renowned Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. He's also on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. He's on the genitourinary steering committee of the Southwest Oncology Group, as well as the National Cancer Institute's Bladder Cancer Task Force. And I've had the fortune of knowing him for a few years. And what struck me in the first meeting, in addition to all his accolades and accomplishments and his cutting edge research, was his compassion and his generosity, which I admire in a physician, and which I think is instrumental in every physician, particularly in that physician-patient relationship. So I'm very glad and truly honored to have you be my guest today, Dr. Sonpavde, Guru Sonpavde, everyone. Welcome to All Out Coach, Guru.
Thanks, Tim, for the invitation and the kind words. I'm glad to be engaged with you on this program.
Great. What were some of the episodes, or who were some of the people that helped you determine your career path and helped you manifest how you became the director of the Bladder Cancer program at Dana-Farber?
Back when I was in medical school back in India, where I did my medical school in a medical school called the CMC, Christian Medical College, Vellore, there was a big influence of one of the people who taught me there. And he inspired me, I think, to go into the line of oncology and cancer treatment as a career. After I finished medical school, I came to the US and pursued my career in internal medicine, followed by oncology. And then from oncology, how I got into urologic oncology is, again, a little bit of the influence of the environment. I trained in Indiana University for my oncology fellowship, and there was a big urologic oncology influence. So I guess I felt just a little more comfortable doing urologic oncology. There also seemed to be more of a need for urologic oncology researchers. So that's kind of how I got into urologic oncology.
I see. Were there particular coaches or mentors you had that you would like to recognize?
I think that it's easy for me to say that at Indiana University, there was a big impact of Larry Einhorn, who is, of course, world-renowned for management of testicular cancer, which he developed with his cisplatin-based chemotherapy regimens, which he developed in a very rational manner. So I think that was a big impact. And I've had many mentors, honestly, during my entire career. In addition to that, I've had other people, Nick Vogelsang, Joachim Belmont. There are other people who have inspired me. Tony Choueiri, who's the chief here at Dana-Farber of GU Oncology.
I wanted to highlight the impressions that I had during our first introduction when a colleague of mine who had known you for many years had introduced me. You and I sat down for lunch the very first time we spoke, and you highlighted very quickly, within a brief period of time, all the amazing emerging research and treatments in this area of bladder cancer, in which for some decades there hadn't been any novel treatments. But before we get to those, and which you will probably highlight, I want to ask you about what your perspective is on the physician-patient relationship, and what your approaches are to continuing to be personal in your relationships, whether it's with medical affairs professionals such as myself or with patients, and how has it changed throughout the years?
Yeah, I think in terms of my own approach, I think it's actually not changed a lot. It's been a lot of shared decision making. We discuss all the options with our patients. We try to make them understand, the biology of the disease and why we are doing A versus B, why we would recommend A versus B versus C. And so that I think helps the patients make a decision, and also be confident about a decision they make. I think that maybe there still are people, and it's in the long times in the past it's been somewhat a more paternalistic approach to this in terms of recommending treatment A to the patient. And sometimes you end up actually doing that when some patients want you to kind of help them make a decision for them when they don't have strong feelings. So that does come into the picture sometimes. But overall, I would say that the dominant thought process is mutually, it's a shared decision making based on information given to the patient.
I see. Do you think that the patients are now more educated than ever? Are they more demanding than ever because they can get a lot of information more readily than ever? And does that present a challenge to you as a physician, an expert?
It can be sometimes. I don't actually I admire patients who are well informed and come armed with information and want to have a rational discussion about all the options available out there and all the emerging options, possibilities of clinical trials. So I think that such patients always lead to a kind of a longer, more thoughtful discussion, actually, when they come in armed with information. However, there is also some information out there on the internet and in the news media that can be misleading at times. Maybe there is some irrational enthusiasm about certain treatments. And I'm not saying that these treatments don't work in some people, in some patients, but there can be some, enthusiasm for certain treatments based on how a drug is being advertised in the media, for example. So those need to be countered with a more rational and balanced discussion with patients.
I really want to focus our discussion today on the role of innovative clinical research on the continuity of care. Because as a pharmacist myself, I always observed, how it is that patients changed their physicians, how they went from one hospital to another, how they changed insurance plans, and how the healthcare system either placed them at an advantage or at a disadvantage in terms of the continuity of care they receive. How can you help patients get access to a lot of the new novel treatments that they have that I know you research, and to make sure that they actually are involved in the best trials for them, and then afterwards receive those treatments?
That's a great question, Tim. And we always try to bring the most cutting edge trials to patients, the exciting, promising drugs out there that we would like to make them available to patients. We try to bring these to patients. It's not always possible to bring every exciting drug to a patient at a specific institution. So it's because of the the issue of competing trials out there. So we can't have, for example, 3 trials for the same patient population in in one institution. So sometimes it does turn out that patients have to go to other institutions seeking the best trial that's the best fit for them. But having said that, we do try to get the most exciting drugs to our patients at our institution. In terms of patients seeking, second opinions and going to other programs, that happens, and we accept that as it's just like you and I when we want to buy a car, we may go, try out 4 or 5 different cars before we pick one. So it's kind of like that. So it's all part of the process of patients seeing where they find the best management for them. There is sometimes the patient-doctor connect that patients and doctors mutually feel with certain people and maybe not with others. There's always, a certain match that works sometimes. So I think that it's reasonable for patients to, of course, seek what they think is best for them.
I imagine you have many memorable stories of how you have transformed the lives of patients with the cutting edge research that you do. Are there some that you can share in terms of the effect of some of these treatments on the patients, as many of them may be listening and maybe considering Dana-Farber?
Yeah, I think that there are always there are some stories for sure. Like I could share with you. Maybe one that sticks out is a patient that really we thought was terminal, had progressed through 3 different types of treatment for metastatic bladder cancer.
Uh-huh.
And we offered an immunotherapy trial that was combining, a novel immunotherapy drug with an existing immunotherapy drug. And really, the chances of a great response are, actually low in a phase 1 trial, which this was. Phase 1 trials are testing brand new drugs, first time in human beings. So in kind of trials like that, there's always the promise, but there is not a response rate that we can quote to patients that the patients can expect. So this patient just sticks out for me because we really thought this patient was not going to make it beyond a few weeks or a few months. But the patient, I'm happy to tell you, after having been on this trial, is still alive and in a complete remission 2 years out, believe it or not.
Yeah.
So, we do change the lives of patients with some of these exciting novel agents. However, I don't want to again create an irrational enthusiasm for a specific drug, and I don't want to mention the drug exactly that we use in this patient. But I suffice it to say that I think clinical trials are a great way to go because in most patients, the current treatments don't cure them. So trials looking at promising new drugs, new combinations really are a great way to go.
Yeah. The healthcare system, the way it's designed currently, all the stakeholders, do you think that it gives clinicians enough opportunities or enough time in order to ask the right questions, in order to really investigate the root causes of particular symptoms or the history of patients? Because that's something that patients, I know I hear that from a lot of patients that, and I'm coming back, I guess, to that patient-doctor relationship, but I want to ask what your opinion is on in terms of the day-to-day restrictions that physicians may feel or obligations, where if they're not, let's say, in an academic center, if they're in the community somewhere and they have to see, let's say, I don't know, 15, 20 patients or many more patients a day, do they prioritize or are they conditioned to, or in order to investigate, the best course of treatment for that patient?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tim. I have been in practice around 20 years now. So for the first 10 years of my career, we really did not have the electronic medical record system. And for the next 10 years, I did have the electronic medical record system. And I can tell you that there are pros and cons of the EMR system. And one of the things that, is a negative is that when we're talking to the patient, it just takes a lot longer to enter data into the EMR. Now, I think that some of the younger folks who are more, savvy with the electronic things, the setup in the EMR might be faster, but it does, in my experience, work slower in terms of time investment in getting through the electronic medical record system, documenting things, and putting in the orders. It takes a whole lot longer than it used to. And one of the things that I hope will develop is some kind of AI system that can capture the conversation between the doctor and the patient in the room and kind of and transcribe that and into the EMR. I think that would be a great advance, and I know there are people working on it in the high tech arena, and I hope that happens sooner than later. Because honestly, the EMR system, in terms of the time it takes, it does tend to be a little bit of a barrier between the patient and physician in terms of the interaction.
Yes.
So because there's just so many hours in a day. So I think that would be a big benefit of having a system where the conversation is captured and transcribed into not only the note, but also
Hmm.
captured into the ordering system, into the EMR. That would be a great benefit.
Yeah. Great. So I'd like to transition then, since you've alluded to some innovative solutions for healthcare system, back to medicine and back to bladder cancer. If you could give us a summary, of some of the emerging treatments or research that you are most excited about now, I think that would be helpful for the listeners who may be considering them.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So, as you know, my area is bladder cancer research. I'm a medical oncologist. So, we investigate new drugs in clinical trials.
Yeah.
And we also study the tumor tissue to study new therapeutic targets in translational research. So, in terms of clinical trials, there's been a lot of movement in terms of agents out there. We've always had platinum based chemotherapy
Hmm.
for 20, 30 years and longer. Of course, we now have immunotherapy with immune checkpoint inhibitors, as we call them. These drugs unleash the T cells, the immune cells of the body to fight the cancer. There's a PD-1, PD-L1 inhibitors
Hmm.
that are out there for treating patients who are progressing post-platinum-based chemotherapy. And a couple of them are also approved in the first line setting for metastatic disease if you
Yeah.
have a high PD-L1 protein level, or if you're not eligible for chemo, then you can do these drugs as first line. We now also have the advent of drugs called antibody-drug conjugates,
Uh-huh.
which are essentially a smart way of giving chemotherapy. So these are targeting certain proteins on the cancer cell, and these antibodies are conjugated with a strong chemotherapy. So that's why they're called antibody-drug conjugates. So it's a smart way of delivering strong chemotherapy to the cancer cell in a more specific manner. So you have less toxicities of free-floating chemotherapy in the blood. So
Hmm.
there's a couple of drugs out there now, enfortumab vedotin, sacituzumab, govitecan. So two drugs that are in this ADC, antibody-drug conjugate class. There's
Hmm.
also the targeted drug called erdafitinib, which is an FGFR inhibitor.
Right.
It only works in around 20% of patients who have a mutation in the FGFR3 or 2 gene
Yes.
in the cancer cell. So again, all of these drugs have provided an advance, help people live longer, but they're
Mm.
not going to cure patients, at least not cure most patients.
Yep.
We think maybe a small minority of patients might be cured with
Hmm.
immunotherapy, but we don't know
Hmm.
that for sure. We still need some longer follow-up. Now, what's going on is exciting trials of other new immunotherapy drugs or combinations of these drugs. For example, combining enfortumab vedotin, the antibody-drug conjugate, with an immunotherapy drug looks very promising in early studies. So that's being looked at. Also, combining two immunotherapy drugs like nivolumab and ipilimumab looks promising preliminarily. So that's being looked at in a big phase 3 trial. So I think that the results of these future trial data that will come out from these trials might change the standard of care once again.
Hmm. Hmm. Great. Are there any particular new areas that are of research that you feel are untapped yet, or are we? Or I can rephrase that question to: do you feel that the research in bladder cancer that's funded and that's most prioritized actually addresses those that are in most need for new treatments, or do you think there are other areas?
I think there are other areas. So the key really is I don't think we still understand fully the
Mhm.
biology of bladder cancer.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
that's why we've been unable to cure most patients.
I
And so
see.
the study of tumor tissue, not only tumor tissue, but the host, the patient,
Right.
um, the genes in the patient himself or herself, the germline factors, the host factors, tumor factors, both need to be studied in more detail and more depth to understand the right drug or the right combination of drugs for the
Mhm.
right patient. So that's precision medicine. So there's a lot that needs to be done with precision medicine. We still don't know the optimum patient that will benefit from cisplatin chemotherapy. We actually don't have a great way of saying who's going to benefit the most from immunotherapy. And even more importantly, we don't know a way of saying the group of patients that will not benefit at all from immunotherapy or chemotherapy, because those are the patients who really have the greatest need for a new drug. And so we really need to try to identify biomarkers, not just that predict response, but that predict progression, like very resistant disease, so we can really focus on them with brand new drugs.
I see. And some of these new modified approaches may require combination treatments in order to help maximize the effect or the benefit of another class of medications,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. We don't think that a single drug is going to be able to cure patients. Occasionally, we might get lucky, like single immunotherapy drug, like a PD-1 inhibitor, might cure some patients. We still need to wait for longer follow-up. We have seen durable complete remissions, which might be cures in some patients. But for the vast majority, this is a heterogeneous disease. It's driven by various pathways and various molecules. So likely that we will need combinations to cure most patients.
In terms of the screening, Dr. Sonpavde, there's various different ways to screen. Some are invasive, others are more non-invasive. What is your opinion on the liquid biopsy, molecular, testing versus, let's say, the other kind of more invasive means of testing, and then also radiology? Where does radiological findings fit into the screening and and even treating some patients, right, for some of the different conditions within blood?
Yes. So non-invasive testing is really making progress, and I think will fulfill a huge demand actually. So circulating tumor DNA or ctDNA looks very promising. Actually, in bladder cancer, there is a lot of shedding of DNA from the tumor. So bladder cancer is one of those cancers where 90% of patients will have some circulating tumor DNA. And this is in metastatic disease patients. In earlier disease, like non-metastatic disease, there is a lower chance of finding ctDNA in the blood. But where it's been studied, a different format has been studied in non-metastatic disease using ctDNA to detect minimal residual disease, so MRD for short. So for example, patients who had a radical cystectomy, the bladder has been removed, or muscle invasive aggressive bladder cancer, the cancer is still looking localized. So we want to give these patients adjuvant or post-operative chemotherapy or immunotherapy. But do we really know the patients? Can we detect patients who are destined to relapse versus the patients who don't have any microscopic disease elsewhere and are not going to relapse? So now we might be getting closer to that goal, because one study that looked at it and showed that ctDNA, the presence of ctDNA predicted recurrence quite well actually, and in those patients, adjuvant immunotherapy seemed to improve outcomes in this trial. So this was a retrospective analysis, so this is still being looked at prospectively. But so far, it looks promising that minimal residual molecular evidence of disease could be detected using ctDNA. So there's two ways of ctDNA being helpful. One, to see the alterations in the tumor using ctDNA profiling from blood. And secondly, to detect minimal residual disease by detecting the presence of the DNA from the tumor in the blood when the scans don't show it. So it's showing you molecular disease.
Yeah. Okay. Are patients now expecting easier screening, testing, and longer survival? Like, just for the lack of better terms, just how has the prognosis of bladder cancer and different forms of it improved as a result of the cutting edge research?
So ctDNA profiling is still in its infancy. And I think you also asked about scans. So in terms of scans, we still don't have perfect way of telling the true extent of the cancer in the bladder. in terms of how deep the cancer is. The MRI might be better than CAT scanning. There are multi-parametric MRIs coming on board, but we still have a ways to go. So one of the ways of detecting tumor recurring in the bladder might be DNA in the urine, not blood, but the urine. So urine cell-free DNA is also making some progress in terms of early studies to help us detect cancer recurrence earlier in the bladder. So I think that with the combination of this molecular DNA studies using non-invasive urine or blood samples, and the combination with the better scanning, MRI, and maybe other better technologies that might come on board, I think we should be able to get much better at staging bladder cancer.
Great. So that's very promising to hear. Do you currently spend most of your time in research, or do you also see patients in clinically as well?
It's a 50-50 mix, Tim. So I spend half my time in the clinic seeing patients, and of course, we offer clinical trials to patients in the clinic. The other half is spent with research work, writing grants or writing concepts to study tumor tissue. We have grants to study tumor tissue from metastatic bladder cancer patients. Most of the molecular, DNA analysis of these tumors has been done in patients before they were treated, not after. So we are really keen on analyzing tumor tissue, cancer cells, after progression, after all these previous treatments like platinum-based chemotherapy or immunotherapy, enfortumab vedotin. So after all these drugs, the tumor might change its character, might have different molecules driving it. So we really wanted to study that. So we really focus right now on studying the mechanisms of resistance to treatment by specifically studying tumor tissue that was harvested on a biopsy after progression on all these treatments.
Okay, and the recurrence rate is quite high in bladder cancer, right? So that presents an important challenge as well, right?
That's right. So muscle invasive bladder cancer, even after you take the bladder out, do a radical cystectomy,
right?
About half the time it does recur. And metastatic bladder cancer, once it's spread on the scans, radiologically spread, that's usually not curable. Rarely it is in a proportion of patients. So those patients have the biggest unmet needs.
So now I'd like to shift gears a little bit to the pharmaceutical industry and your relationship with pharma industry, because I've known throughout my career quite a lot of academic experts and scientific experts, scientists, physician researchers like yourselves, who did not always work as closely with the pharmaceutical industry. Yet I don't think that I wouldn't describe you to fall within that group, because I feel that you are a critical thinker, a forward thinker who's open mind, who's a very open-minded and who's driven by innovation. And one of those means is through important partnerships with the pharmaceutical industry. The medical division, and the medical division of the pharmaceutical industry, the research, R&D, and medical, how can they improve the research that is actually reaching the clinics and reaching the patients in order to predict patient outcomes, in order to anchor the research in the labs, in the investigational setting, to actual clinical outcomes that matter to the patients? That's something that I'm curious about to hear from you.
That's a challenging question to answer, Tim, because the pharmaceutical industry, of course, has a slightly different focus than probably an academic researcher. At the end of the day, I think that they complement each other. They fulfill different roles. And I would say that generally the engagement between pharma and academic researchers has been good. Can it be better? Yeah, I think it can be better. I think both pharma and academicians need to listen more to each other and understand each other's needs. I think that some of the unmet needs And we have differing opinions, as you know, a researcher from institution B may have a different opinion from my opinion, let's say.
Yeah.
And so there might be 5 different opinions coming at pharma. And so at the end of the day, it could be a tough decision actually for pharma to make in terms of should they develop their drug in situation A or situation B or C.
Yeah.
So I think that it boils down to a lot of these are sometimes business-oriented decisions and not necessarily a scientific decision.
Right.
Just looking at the landscape of who else is developing what in what space. So I understand how that goes. So, but I think that overall, I would say I'm reasonably satisfied with interactions between pharma and myself, and we all should always continue to strive to improve that relationship, of course.
Yeah. If you could teach patients one detail or a different, let's say, perspective about research and how they get access to it, what would you share with them? What would you share with them that you think would help them have better expectations, more accurate expectations from the products, from the agents they take, or the research studies they're involved in? Is there some message to the patients as well?
I think that the key message is that clinical trials are a standard of care. One of the things that's out there is some patients believe getting on a research trial means there's some kind of a lab rat, or they might get placebo. They have a preconceived notion that there might be a placebo, and I will never get the right treatment. That kind of notion is out there. I do want to dispel that. Research is a standard of care, and sometimes, actually, many times, is better than standard of care. You get closer monitoring, and however, I will say that sometimes research is not the right way to go. Also, so there might be a patient that potentially cannot wait a couple of weeks to get some of these study procedures done in the screening process that it takes to leading up to starting therapy on a trial. I admit that there are some patients like that are progressing so fast that they really can't wait 2 weeks. That happens. But in general, barring a patient like that, or a patient where biologically we feel that treatment A is clearly probably better than a research a treatment on a research. Barring specific situations where we feel strongly, I would highly encourage patients enrolling on a trial, which I think is should be considered a standard of care.
Thank you. Those are important points for our listeners. The generation of data, and how quickly we generate data in terms of real world evidence. There's many registries. Are we improving in terms of in the transparency of the clinical trial data and in the speed, in the time efficiency of actually communicating that data so that we can react and act upon it a little bit more quickly? Choose the right patient populations in whom to consider patients based on these new results. Are we seeing the results as quickly as you want to see? Do you see any improvement in that over the last few years?
I think we've seen some improvement in that situation in the past few years. The data seem to be coming out reasonably quickly. The data are out there, and even the FDA approvals, the regulatory process seems a little more efficient than I remember many years ago. So I do think the system is more efficient. One thing I probably should have mentioned, but I'll mention it now, is one of the things is about these trials is that trials provide a data set to analyze and mine retrospectively for nuggets of data that are missed in the initial presentation. And sometimes it is that you have to combine multiple trials, which may have been conducted by different companies, to generate these hypothesis-generating data or new discoveries. So that's where I think industry, I see, is hesitant to collaborate with other company. Pharma is not collaborating as well with each other, I would say, in terms of combining data, or even analyzing retrospectively more aggressively. I think that's where we could make more progress in terms of collaborating between pharma companies. And I don't see that happening as much as I'd like it to. And that would be, I think,
I agree with
that would
that.
help us make more advances even faster.
Yeah, very important point that I agree with wholeheartedly, Dr. Sonpavde. Although I do see some of the companies starting to make some headway in that direction. I heard of a new initiative that Boehringer Ingelheim had started a few years ago, where they invested their staff, their time into an initiative that trained other pharmaceutical companies on conducting clinical trials. And I think it was a win-win approach from their standpoint, and they launched this initiative via social media, out of all places, via LinkedIn Live, and it had thousands of people who attended. I was one of them, but the initiative was memorable. It sticks out in my mind because it, I think, takes advantage of all of that research and all those new promising agents, and making sure that the studies are conducted in the best quality way, because a lot of the smaller companies then are merge together, or they're acquired by larger companies. So it only serves to the benefit of those larger companies, and like Boehringer Ingelheim or like others, in order to to improve the quality of research, period. So I could not agree with you more on that. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sonpavde, for sharing your perspectives. Is there one new area of research or one agent, let's say, that you're working on now, or that you would like to share with others?
Well, one interesting avenue of research I've been focused on, in addition to testing new drugs and resistance mechanisms, I'm also interested in repurposing drugs that are used for other conditions. For example, a drug used for diabetes, metformin, has looked interesting. I specifically, in my case, I have been interested in developing angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, angiotensin pathway inhibitors like ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. There is a lot
are used
of
for blood pressure, right?
Exactly right. They used to treat blood pressure, and so there is a lot of data that Dr. Rakesh Jain at Massachusetts General Hospital has generated with showing how these drugs can increase perfusion to tumors, improving drug delivery, and reducing interstitial pressure, and also enhancing the immune state in the microenvironment. So we have some very interesting data, and we are trying to develop these in the clinic, because one of the advantages of a drug like this is these drugs are widely available globally, they're cheap. So drugs like this can sometimes have a more global and wide impact than a new drug coming out of the lab, which tends to be very expensive for most of the world. So we're really keen on developing this avenue of repurposing drugs in general, and right now specifically the angiotensin inhibitors.
Great. Well, I wish you lots of luck with that, and I thank you on behalf of the healthcare professional community and the patients as well for all of the amazing work that you're doing. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the next time we speak.
Thank you, Tim. I look forward to it.